nobody's help, and I'm coming for the belt. Lights, camera, and the throne. They can try to tell me no. If they do, I let them go. Got no time to play it slow. If they try to come back, then I gotta send them home. This is the moment.
So we have several categories that we're going to discuss, and you might be wondering, oh, Rachel, you're in a different background. My son started band camp today, which is right across the street from my office, so I thought I would hang out here while I wait for him to finish band camp. Alrighty, so we're going to start with these 5 categories. Physical impairments, or also maybe known in your state as orthopedic impairments, visual impairments, hearing impairments, deaf and blind. And as we discuss these impairments, again, very briefly, because 1, you're definitely able to read the screen, but 2, how these impairments are described and defined, while they aren't different, often are described different by each state in their special education legislation regarding who is eligible and who is not eligible for services through an IEP or 504. So while we're going over this today, Jesse and Spirit, please be sure that you look at your web pages for your state, and we've included those links in the IEP session of the recording. And as we talk about these, consider universal design for learning. Are there accommodations and modifications that you're using that maybe instead of it being an accommodation or modification for that one student, it could be an option for all students so that one student doesn't feel outside of the curriculum or outside of class, but rather a part of. So a quick reminder that, and again, for those of you who are really into the sports ball, I'm going to do my best with this metaphor. I'm not a sports ball person. If I'm going to something, it's for the marching band. So here we go. An accommodation levels the playing field. So a support or supplement that allows a student to participate as typically developing students. So enlarged notation, alternative fingerings. What's another one? I said notation, fingerings, alternative seating, those things that really anybody could take to kind of ease themselves into their learning. So an accommodation just levels the playing field. It allows multiple entry points. A modification changes the field. So when the expectations of learning, even with an accommodation, so let's say that we have a student who is provided an alternative fingering, but even that still is a barrier to their learning and their growth, a change must be made. So it could be that rather than having an alternative fingering, an alternative part is written. So we change the music that student is playing. So for example, if I am working with a 6th grade beginning band and I have a clarinet player who doesn't have the reach due to a physical difference of not having all digits on their hand, and that alternative fingering still isn't working, I could rewrite the part until, as they get older, they might be able to develop that reach for that alternative fingering. Okay, so physical impairments are differences that can be congenital, which is genetic at birth, or they could be due to disease, or they could be due to injuries. There are neurological as well as musculoskeletal physical impairments. So neurological typically affects the central nervous system. So think about the brain and that nervous line of neural fibers that go down the spine. You're going to see some medical terminology, this idea of mild to severe. My son, Ben, who has autism and ADHD, he's not mildly autistic or severely autistic. He's just autistic in the way in which Ben is autistic. These terms that you hear, mild and severe, are also used in IEPs. So there's a picture later that will kind of describe this idea of disability more of as a spectrum rather than this linear progression of mild to severe. These neurological diagnoses can include cerebral palsy, seizure disorders, spina bifida, spinal cord and traumatic brain injuries. Musculoskeletal occur to diseases or differences in the muscles or bones. So some students are born with the ability to then learn how to walk and move around, but over time they have a degenerative muscle disorder or a degenerative bone disorder, which over time moves them from walking to maybe walking with braces and then eventually walking being a wheelchair user. So a little bit about each. Cerebral palsy is neurological. It's typically congenital, but not always. There are a few rare cases that it is something that is acquired. There's a lack of muscle control, and there is a rigidity in some, and it can increase over time depending on the type of cerebral palsy the individual is diagnosed with. Epilepsy is a seizure disorder, whether you have tonic-clonics or absences. So the tonic-clonic used to be called a grand mal seizure. That's when the whole body tenses up and you think, there's that stereotypical thing that's considered, you might see on TV where the eyes roll back, and that's not what they always look like. A tonic-clonic is a seizing of the nervous system. There's a misfiring, and so the body is kind of resetting, and what you're seeing is that process of the neural fibers trying to get back into sync. I had a student that I taught years ago that had absence seizures where we're talking and we're participating, and then all of a sudden they just kind of zone out for a little bit, and then they come back. They can last anywhere from 10 seconds to 2 minutes. So, if you have students like that, it's important to pay attention to their activity level, pay attention to their facial expressions, as well as their eye movements. Spina bifida is congenital. It can happen to an injury, which basically there's an opening in the spinal cord. So I'm not going to get into the development of a baby over time. But the brain and the spine are one of the first things to develop. And as our bodies are developing as babies, things are enclosed. And part of a child's development, a child who's born with spina bifida, there's a part in the spinal column where the spinal fluid and that bone aren't completely sealed off. And so, I've had students who've had spina bifida and are able to walk with braces or a walker. My daughter danced with an individual who was a wheelchair user due to her spina bifida, and they simply modified the dance routine so that this individual could partake in the ballet productions. Traumatic brain injuries can cause physical impairments depending on where the injury is to the brain. There can be a change in motor function or a loss of motor function. Muscular dystrophy is neurological, and it's where the muscles become weaker over time. So just some considerations for music educators. Consider, and you're going to see a lot of overlap over these as we go through each one, that all the considerations that we make for individuals with impairments. Think about mobility issues, let me rephrase that. Mobility needs, academic needs, social needs, and environmental needs. I was going to pause so that you can read it. And I'll do that periodically. I'll ask you to pause so that you can read the slide, and then I'll move on with the video. So next we're going to talk about visual impairment. So a typical eye can see it at a range about 180. And the distance that one can see and identify objects, that defines vision. So Someone who is quote unquote legally blind, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have no vision. It just means that is a larger percentage of their vision they're not able to see and define objects from certain distances. Or they have restricted fields of vision. They might be functionally blind, have low vision. Blindness can be, visual impairments can be congenital, or they can be acquired. And if we consider any of us who wear glasses have a visual impairment, without my glasses, everyone is fuzzy unless you're really up close to my face. But with my glasses, I can see things clearly, and I can drive, etc. So there's a few different types of visual impairments, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But the thing that is interesting and what we should know as music educators is that the way that the eye works is that our fields of vision are actually processed by both areas of the brain, and our occipital lobe is in the back of our brain. So if we have a student who has a TBI to the back of the brain, they might incur a temporary visual impairment. If you've ever fallen and seen stars because you hit the back of your head, that's because you have jostled this area of the brain. So our right visual field is considered in the left part of our brain, and our left visual field is processed in the right part of our brain. So it's important, if we're looking at individuals who might have visual needs in their left eye versus visual needs in their right eye, placement of yourself or placement of reading materials or projected materials. So here's a little bit about each. If you would like to please pause and read. And here are a few considerations. We have peer helpers listed a lot for mobility. Please just be careful when you're asking students to help other students that you're not always assigning the same student helper. It's important that the individual with the impairment is a part of the class in general, and that they're working with and becoming partners with or friends with everyone in the class, rather than being isolated to that one student who's always willing to help, or maybe aren't willing to help but don't wish to say no. Provide multiple options for movement. Just consider there might be some language delays if an individual has a more lower visual ability, meaning that they can only see but so much up close. That might impact their language acquisition. I taught a student my very last year of teaching who had a neurological condition as well as a visual impairment, and they could only see about this much. So if you want to close your left eye and open your right eye and then make a fist, that's about as much as this individual could see. And so they were very independent and wanted to not necessarily use some of the accommodations put into place. So when we looked at visuals in music, or we were reading from the board, I extended time for everyone and found that that benefit wasn't just for the student who had the visual need, but it actually benefited a lot of the other students in the classrooms, those who maybe had a language impairment or those who were learning English as their second language. So again, we've already talked about being mindful of social needs, and then there's environmental needs as well. You can't help a lot of the environmental needs. You're not the one building the school or maintaining the school. But if you know you have a student who's coming in who's using a cane for sight, it's important that you advocate that the floors are even, or if there is carpeting, that the carpeting is checked and laid flat. And these are a lot of things that the administrator, your administrator, can help with. All right, that brings us to hearing impairments. The diminution of hearing to the severity that services are required is what hearing impairment is. So hearing impairments can impact language acquisition. It can impact social engagement, as well as as a result, academic achievement. Students all of us, regardless of our ability differences, want to be included. We want to be a part of the group. We want to be able to participate. And having a hearing impairment can maybe isolate that student depending on their level of hearing. Hearing impairments can be congenital, again, that's being born with, or they can be acquired. Hearing loss happens a lot over time, more typically so in adults than individuals, children, but it happens. Those who are deaf are not considered in the hearing impairment category because hearing impairments and the deaf community is its own culture and community, and the needs of and how deaf individuals communicate and navigate the world are different than those who maybe have cochlear implants or hearing aids, etc. So there are two types, perilingual and postlingual. Perilingual hearing loss means that they lost their hearing before their speech developed, and postlingual means that they lost their hearing after their speech developed. Why is that important? If you're working with students in singing, and giving responses, being open to what those responses sounds like in regards to their hearing loss. If they have perilingual hearing loss, the formation of vowels in a choir or the formation of embouchures for instruments may not be quote unquote what's typically seen in a beginning student, but that doesn't mean that they're not capable. We have to remember that those students who do not have hearing impairments can connect better when we say, no, make your lips look like this letter. Well, that individual with a hearing impairment may not necessarily know that sound because the way they produce that sound is different than one who doesn't have a hearing impairment. So similar to the eyes, the way that we hear, any sound that comes into our left auditory cortices is actually processed by the right brain, and anything that comes into our right ear, sorry, I should have said left ear, is processed by our left ear is processed by the right auditory cortices, right ear is processed by the left auditory cortices. All of our senses intersect at the thalamus, and anything that's coming in from the left moves to the right, anything from the right moves to the left, except for our olfactory senses, which go directly from our nose to the brain. So if you take a look, most of us probably grew up, if you swam in, the lake or went to the pool a lot, probably dealt with outer, middle, and inner ear infections. I got inner ear infections all the time as a kid, and surprised that it didn't really impact my hearing to my knowledge. But what's important is understanding that vibrations are coming into the ear canal and moving the eardrum, which is causing the malleus, the incus, and the stapes to then you see this little horse saddle, not a horse person, the stirrup, there you go, kind of pulse here, which those vibrations are then heard here. And this is odd because you would think, oh, the opening larger is here, so it would hear lower sounds here. The higher the sound, the more they're processed here at the opening. The lower the sound are processed at the peak of the cochlea before moving in through the cochlear nerve to be processed by the auditory cortices. So take a moment and pause, and read a little bit about each of these hearing impairments. So if you're wondering the effect on communication, I pulled this from a group of articles on psychology of music. This comes from McPherson's The Way Children Learn Music. I'm happy to share that in our Discord or in our reading later. It's a great book to have. So you see here, profound loss is considered deaf. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But knowing the degree of loss that a student may have and their impact and its impact on communication as well as processing can help you with how you set up your classroom and how you deliver instruction and how you might incorporate more visuals or how you might place yourself around the room throughout instruction. So some considerations for music educators. Again, this time we're considering language rather than mobility. We have language, academic, social, and environmental considerations. I'm not going to go too in-depth with cochlear implants or FM loop systems or PEC boards because we've talked about these in other videos. And when we have our synchronous groups, we have some of that stuff to bring in to share. And any of these things that especially with assistive devices like iPads or PEC boards that are like the little picture boards that they can pull on and off, talk to your special education teacher and start building a relationship and with them and asking them, if you don't have one already, and asking them how these things, they can tell you all about them and the way in which they can be used in the music classroom. Again, we want to make sure that we are normalizing student behavior. Students come to us socialized in kindergarten, and if they notice it's a behavior that's not quote unquote typical or quote unquote normal, they recognize it. And there is this, subconscious like separation or question. And if we really start at a young age, just be like, no, that's just the way Susie learns. No, that's just the way Johnny communicates. Oh, that's just like we all communicate differently. We all have different needs. The more that we can desocialize and normalize that variability in learning is the norm, I think the more accepting and the more connections these children can make. Again, you want to have good light, use lots of visuals to communicate. Watch the positioning of the equipment. You may not want to have the speaker like right here in the ear, but maybe have a balance of speakers around the room. For the deaf community, for someone to be completely deaf, that means no hearing. That's extremely rare. There is residual hearing, but not sufficient enough to process speech, especially speech and noise, which if we think about it, everywhere we go, there's noise, whether it's the hum of an AC vent or the backing up of trucks or the conversations in another room, or the kid who's in choir and the band room's next door, or you're teaching on the stage and PE is on the other side of the barrier, right? So their primary means of communication in the deaf community is through visuals, whether it's sign language or printed paper or other visuals. One caution with sign language is a language to be respected as any other language. I know in my past, I sometimes would add sign language to songs in choir until I learned that one, I was doing it incorrectly, and two, that the way you sign for music isn't the way that's signed for speaking, and that there's some things that get lost in translation. So with any individual, it's always important to talk to the culture bearer. If you have questions regarding a need, I taught a family of the parents were deaf. I taught these students for 5 years, and all of the children were hearing and the two parents were deaf. And often this mom was great because sometimes she would give me a hard time, not in a bad way, but in a way that she was asking me to consider alternative ways of teaching and communicating so that they could be musical with their children. So be open to pushback and conversations and challenging of the way that we were taught to teach, because Jessie and I have said this a lot, person first. The students that we teach really do know how they learn best. We have more knowledge about music and music teaching, but how they learn and their needs, they're the expert. So if you want to incorporate sign language, or if you want to incorporate more visuals and movement for those who are in the deaf community, reach out and ask what that partnership would look like. Ask what is a respectful way to incorporate them into your instruction and performance. That brings us to deaf and blindness. Individuals can, again, here's this mild and severe. They could either have, almost complete hearing loss and complete visual loss, or they could have more hearing than vision or more vision than hearing, but it doesn't mean that there's a complete loss of either sense. So this one is rare, but often an individual, a child who is deaf and blind, might exhibit behaviors that seem inappropriate or aggressive or different than how a child might typically communicate. But we need to remember that the way that they use language and the way that they communicate needs may be more physical, because they don't have the auditory input or the visual input in order to give auditory and visual output, as in hearing and language, spoken language, the way that other students we teach do. So this is another example of talking with the caregiver, working with the special education teacher, and including the student as much as possible to help them express their needs so that they're able to be a part of the musicking community. So again, here's some considerations. Feel free to pause and read. Oh, I do want to mention Braille. A lot of individuals will consider Braille for those who are visually impaired, whether blind or deaf and blind. I have taught a few students who are blind, and I have gone to grad school with 2 individuals who are blind, and all of them have said that Braille music is basically trash. It lacks expression, it's incredibly large, it's difficult to learn, and so most of these individuals learn by listening. So there are many ways, and I think Jesse does this really well, so I'm going to leave that to him. There's so many ways that students can represent traditional notation and traditional expressive elements in music, and we're going to talk about that, but I'm going to leave it to Jesse because he does it really well. So that brings us to emotional and behavior impairments. This used to be emotional disturbance or behavioral disturbance. We're getting better with our ableist language in academia as well as in the medical field. But an emotional and behavioral impairment could be individuals who demonstrate divergent behaviors, whether it's withdrawal from the group and society or the way in which they engage isn't typical. I taught a kindergarten student who had toxic stress syndrome. That individual had seen more life in their 4 years than I think most of us have seen in our lifetime. And they were so loving. Oh, my camera froze. Let me redo this. Hey, there we go. So this individual student was so loving and so joyful, but just didn't know how to engage respectfully or appropriately because that was never modeled for them. And because people didn't want to engage with them, they didn't understand why, because they're like, I have all this love, I'm going to give you my love. But it was overwhelming for some of the other students, and then this individual, the only way that they knew how to respond to communicate frustration was through physical actions. And being able to work with that kid in music and to see how music brought structure and a way for them to express needs was really, really cool. So just understand, a lot of these words have such negative connotations. Just because a child is aggressive doesn't mean they're bad. I really encourage you to move beyond that binary of good, bad. No student is a bad kid. Behavior is communication, and so many students that we teach just do not know how to communicate their needs in a way that we might consider typical. So here's, again, I'm going to ask you to pause and read, and then we'll move on. So here are some considerations for music educators. Again, you can pause and read. That brings us to intellectual and cognitive impairments. So intellectual and cognitive impairments are typically students that have an IQ of 75 or below. These individuals typically have a limited cognitive function and skill. It could be communication skills, social skills, or they lack independence in life skills, getting dressed, making their food, cleaning up. This used to be called in our nation mental retardation. That has been removed. So if you see documents that still use mental retardation, or individuals that you are working with who might still use mental retardation, encourage them to know that actually in 2009, so well over 10 years, in 2009, Rose's Law removed that term from all legislation. Unfortunately, there are people who either don't know or just don't adhere. We typically use either cognitive impairment or intellectual impairment. So in your IEP documents, in your specific state legislation, you might see CI or II. Here's a little about each. So again, whenever you see the pause, please just pause the video and watch. Read. And here are some considerations for music educators. Before I move on to the next one, one thing that I think, I don't want to speak for Jesse, but I'm pretty sure that he would agree with this. Because a student has an impairment, whether it's a cognitive impairment or autism or physical impairment, doesn't mean that the expectation of their achievement should be less. Every student deserves the most meaningful musicking environment possible. Every student can achieve musically. What that looks like is not going to be the same across students, whether the student has an IEP or not. These students need to do more than just sit and be in our class. These students need to do more than participate. They can learn and they can demonstrate what they have learned. It's just us as the music educator providing them the multiple means of access to show what they know. Again, that would be multiple means of expression, action and expression. Okay, so that brings us to specific learning impairments. So this could be a specific impairment for speech, or language understanding, so language comprehension, reading language, writing language, that can interfere with academic progress. So perception of language and perception of language exchanges, whether socially or academically, are also inhibited. So these do not include visual language or writing impairments due to a visual impairment or hearing impairment or cognitive emotional impairment. This is, the child does not have a cognitive impairment, the child doesn't have a hearing impairment or a visual impairment, and their ability to read language or process language or speak or write language is inhibited. That's a specific learning impairment. So take a little look. I'll please pause and let you read. And I'm going to do my best not to go on about music and language, because that's a passion of mine and a very strong research interest of mine. But typically we're told allow 8 seconds for response time. I'm going to call garbage on that because if we think about a child's brain, especially if you're teaching elementary, very little of that brain is myelinated. So those neurons, while they're firing, they're not firing as fast as if they were myelinated. And the myelin is that fatty sheath that wraps around the neural fiber that helps the neurons fire faster and actually make it from one synapse to the next. And even our high school students, the brain doesn't fully myelinate until 25 to 27. And there's a range there because, depending on the gender, depending on the environment, depending on several factors. But typically the brain finishes myelinating between 26 and 27. Sometimes in women it's earlier. And so K through 12, our students' processing time, especially in elementary, is going to be slower than ours. So often I would wait 15 seconds, and that can be so uncomfortable, right? But silence is okay. Remember, there is music in silence. Lots of visuals, lots and lots and lots of visuals. Create multiple means of expression for language. We would speak but I had pictures for my visual schedule. So every activity that we did had a picture that went with it. When students needed something, I wouldn't stop and have them ask to go to the bathroom or ask to get a pencil or ask to go to the nurse. I incorporated hand signs that represented the bathroom or water. So, 1 finger was this, 2 was something else, 3 was something else. I know that this is H in sign language, but, this was, going to the nurse. That way students could have needs met without necessarily having to use language. So you can maintain instruction while meeting students' needs. For the instrumental individuals, those who are teaching instrumental, dyspraxia is, it's not common, but it's more common than we think. In fact, Daniel Radcliffe has dyspraxia. So individuals who might seem like they're struggling with gross motor skills and working on scales and fingerings might need to have some additional accommodations put in place for the success of learning their scales and learning their embouchure and coordinating between the two. So speech and language is a language impairment that is not associated with hearing loss. Similar to specific learning impairment, it can affect speaking, reading, and writing. Typically with speech and language, speaking, reading, and writing are all impacted at some level, and language may be delayed. And there may be difficulty with receptive language and expressive language. So receiving what someone says and understanding what they mean, and then expressing language and expressing it in a way that meets the response. So I'll talk more about that when we get to autism. Some students might have difficulty with completing sentences or with complex sentences. So how simple can we get our instructions, right? Some students might struggle with acquiring new language or following directions. That's why it's always important to have a visual check of the directions when you're doing an activity, having them posted on the smart board, having the students tell them back to you, and then always asking them, hey, turn to your neighbor and tell each other what the expectation is of the assignment. And some students might have a different flow of language use. So there is, if you've been watching Stranger Things, season 4, in one of the first episodes, we are hearing Millie Bobby Brown, who plays 11, writing and reading the voiceover, the letters, and 11's character had very little interaction growing up during that prime time of language development. If you've ever heard of the case of Jeannie, who was a 13-year-old who was found in California by Child Protective Services. This child had been kept in a room their entire life with no interaction with the parents. Food was brought in and what have you, but there was no language development. There was no play or interaction. And she grew up with she had a speech impairment, a language impairment, because of that lack of interaction. And if you pay attention to the way that Millie Bobby Brown, because if you're wondering what it might sound like for a different flow of language, she does a really good job of the way in which she writes and the way in which she flows her words as she's talking to Mike, is a good example of, again, I'm not saying that we should perform disability at all. I do not support that. But sometimes we don't know what something looks like unless we have an example. And I feel that, Millie Bobby Brown did a really respectful job of understanding the trauma that this character went through and how that impacted their ability to interact with their learning and with society. So if you're looking for an example of what that might sound like, that first episode, just give it a listen. If you don't like gore or frights or jump scares, I wouldn't watch the show. So here's a little about each. And then some considerations for you to consider. So that brings us to characteristics of OHI, so other health impairments. Instead of seeing ADHD or diabetes or asthma or arthritis or leukemia, you're going to see on an IEP OHI. OHI stands for other health impairments, and ADHD is placed here. So these could be differences that affect muscle strength, which is important for those of us who teach instrumental music, because a student could be amazing on the saxophone, but it's too dang heavy for them to hold, and because of low muscle tone, they get tired over time. So there was a student that I taught who has autism, plays the saxophone, but needed to always have a neck strap, but a different neck strap, not that thin one, but a thicker one that could also connect around the back. More commonly, I think, in marching band, because it allowed them, they had the finger dexterity, but they didn't have the muscle tone to maintain the posture with the instrument. So again, that would be an example of an accommodation. Which you could easily say anybody who feels like they would benefit from having a neck and back strap while they play their saxophone or clarinet or what have you. I have a few up here at the table. Go ahead and grab one as you make it your way to your seat. Is a good example of a universal accommodation. Some students struggle with impulsivity, that would be my son, and some students really struggle with environmental stimuli. So like if you're looking at my office is not a good example of environmental stimuli. I have Lego because I love building Lego. I have, so many colorful books in a red fridge, and I have my pride flag, and I have pictures everywhere. Consider when you're setting up your classrooms, as someone who loved to buy all of the rainbow chevrons to have up every year, I found that the less I put on the walls, the more focused the students were. And to be honest, the more focused I was, because often I'd be like, oh, that's a really pretty color over there. Oh, that's a really pretty poster. Because I too get easily distracted. For students who have sickle cell anemia or nephritis, let kids go to the bathroom. Let kids get drinks of water. A lot of students, they just need to move. So, providing students, a little break if you have a 75-minute band rehearsal, or, providing a moment or two if you have a student who has sickle cell anemia or nephritis, they need to have water consistently throughout the day, saying, okay, the last minute, we're going to line up early and each of you get a drink of water if you want one and get back in line. I taught a student who had sickle cell anemia, and often it's something I had to do because she refused to go get water because she didn't want to look different from her peers, and so I had to put that in place for her. So here's a little about each. And some considerations. That brings us to autism. Autism is a spectrum disorder. Sometimes we think about it linearly, like, mild autism, severe autism, low functioning, high functioning. Autism isn't a linear line. Think of it like a pie. And some people might have more of, for my son, he has higher social needs, and more difficulty with expressive language. Like, he thinks that he's speaking in a certain way, but often it comes out a little direct and sharp, and sometimes his receptive language, when we're asking him to do things, he often thinks that we're nagging him or bullying him because the way that he hears what we say isn't how he's perceiving it. But that's not in every student with autism. Some children with autism are actually pretty awesome with receptive and expressive language, but socially they prefer to be alone and do everything parallel. I'm going to do my thing here while you're doing your thing there, and the two shall never meet in between. So communication skills aren't always impacted. That negatively impacted my family. My son has been speaking in full sentences since he was 2 years old, and has been very able to communicate. He has been reading since he was 3. He basically taught himself how to read. And, his kindergarten teacher, I said, hey, I think my son's on the spectrum. Could you just watch out for these things? And her response was, oh, well, he's too smart to have autism. Autism doesn't work that way. So just understand that this idea of a spectrum is more of a wheel and less of a line. Typically, children who have autism are diagnosed before age 3, not the age. But in our case, Benjamin was not. Repetitive movements you might see, but may not. My son's friend who has autism has to move his hands and flap and jump, whereas my son has to twirl his hair. His stems have changed over time. When he was 4, he would have to run loops around the house. When he was 6, he started the flapping. That lasted a year, and the past year has been twirling his hair and pacing. So, and that's just his way to communicate whether he's frustrated or whether he's thinking or whether he's bored. All of those, what we call stems, aren't excessive behavior or excessive energy. It's actually a way that an individual with autism communicates a need. Sometimes there's inflexibility in schedules. I know that if our schedule changes without warning, that can be difficult. So having a visual schedule, having band folders or orchestra folders or choir folders that has a schedule for the day, or instead of putting it in just that folder, always having a visual schedule at the front of the class so the student can follow along. And just be aware of sensory input. Sometimes the chairs that we use in our classrooms give negative sensory input. Sometimes these lights, they give me negative sensory input and often leave me with migraines. So some things to consider are here. And just be mindful that something that might work for 2 months with any individual with a disability might work for 2 months, and then they're like, I'm done. For example, my son really needs visuals, but he doesn't. He came to me yesterday and said, I don't want an IEP anymore. I just want to be normal. I'm like, kiddo, you are completely normal. You just have some learning supports. He's like, I don't want them. I'm going into middle school, and I don't want people to think that I'm different. So again, this is an instance of talking to my son and asking him what he needs. He's going to be 11, so we have those conversations a lot more. He participates in his IEP meetings. Don't be afraid to ask the kid. They might be 6, they might be 12, they might be 15, but kids really do know what they need. And it provides so much empowerment for them to go, I'm lost here, bud. Do you think we could have a conversation about how we could best support you in class? And then that brings us to traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury could be due to a concussion, a car accident, a sports injury, or unfortunately abuse in the home. These can result in temporary or permanent impairments and can affect language, mobility, attention, executive functioning, or even physical ability. I'll let you pause and read. And then that brings us to multiple disabilities. So multiple disabilities is really understood as having more than one impairment. In the IEP and in the literature, you're going to see the word comorbid a lot. I really hate that term because it makes it seem, it really sets the child apart. There's nothing morbid about it. This individual just happens to have, like my son, he's thrice exceptional. He has autism, he has ADHD, and he has a really high IQ. He's extremely gifted and more intelligent than I will ever be. Some students that I've taught in autism specific classes have autism and a cognitive impairment, or autism and a language impairment that's not a part of the autism. And this idea of, I won't get on the soapbox about gifted programs. I think every student needs a way to extend their learning in a way that fits them, not only those students who have demonstrated a certain IQ. Every student is gifted and every student is exceptional in their own unique way. Wow, what would happen if we treated every student as exceptional and unique and provided learning opportunities for them at their entry point? I think we'd see some pretty awesome things. So some characteristics of developmental delays are individuals who maybe you have a freshman in your beginning band. If there is beginning band, I think most band directors let people start in ninth grade. They might have a developmental delay and where they're physically 14, but cognitively they're 8 or 9. It could be gross or motor impairments where it's not that they have a physical impairment, but that their motor development is not developing at a quote-unquote typical rate. And so these delays are not the result of a separate impairment. So an individual with Down syndrome isn't going to have a developmental delay. An individual with autism isn't developmentally delayed. It's developmental delays that are not a result of a separate diagnosis. Some considerations. And then if you're looking for some specific literature on some of these diagnoses that we've talked about, I would like for you to go ahead and scan that QR code. And then before we close this, Jesse and I really wanted to talk to you about, and this one is specific to autism. Autism is not linear. It's more of a spectrum, a wheel spectrum. And the thing that I absolutely love about this is it's not low functioning or high functioning. This is how I learn. This is how I exist in this space. These are the needs that I have. And that's every student that we teach. That's us. Each of us as music educators, we need certain conditions for our own learning. We need certain conditions for our own teaching to be successful. So if we look at this idea of some might have a little bit more social awareness and someone might have less. Someone might have really high executive functioning, but really low emotional regulation. That would be my son. And then I'll leave you with this. Those that we teach aren't a little bit impaired or a lot impaired. They are differently abled, as we all are, and have different strengths and weaknesses, and needs, learning needs.
Flip on your TV and try to make sense out of that.
we are going to go through what an IEP is, and this one is going to go a lot faster than the disability categories. And just remember that when with Jesse and I sharing the information on the disability categories, the child is more than their disability, and so that information, labels can be harmful, but these labels also provide us information in how to teach and how to adjust curriculum and how to create manipulatives. So the labels, when I use them when I get the IEP, it just gives me information on things that I might need to do to pivot, but I don't consider, like, the disability isn't the kid. It's just that IEP, which we're getting ready to talk about, is just information that is a guide to help me be the teacher that student needs. So in our schools, we have what's called Child Find and Zero Reject. So what that means is that Child Find is that any child that is identified by a teacher can be evaluated regardless of the severity of the disability. So again, we're getting back to this linear thing. That's more medical and how the school functions. That's not how we are functioning in this professional development. Child Find can be from birth to 21 years of age. The government does provide, and some insurances will accept early services at early childhood centers or therapy centers. We have a few autism centers here in Bloomington Normal. The thing about Child Find is parents can request an evaluation, but they don't have to. And in addition, you might have parents who are resistant to a child having an IEP. A parent approval isn't needed for eligibility tests. However, that approval is needed for services to be given through an IEP. So while a parent cannot reject testing eligibility, a parent can reject services provided, and that's difficult as a teacher. So zero reject means that no child eligible under IDEA may be provided a free and appropriate education. But again, some children do slip through the cracks, and that is either because parents refuse to sign and provide the supports. We as teachers can provide them, but a parent can reject the IEP if they'd like. Parental consent. Parents may request testing at any time, and they can request a meeting at any time. So when a parent, let's say I would go to my son's school and I say, I want my son tested for services, the school has 30 days from the day of request to initiate, to have a meeting and to initiate testing. Again, parents can deny testing and IEP support if they so choose, but typically the schools do go through with the testing to see what their eligibility is. So for example, I taught a girl in 5th grade who came from, her parents were immigrating from the Middle East, and the parent, this child needed services and support for language, not because English was a second language, but they also had language delays in their home language, in their first language. And so they were found eligible. The parent didn't want testing, but we, Child Find, zero reject, we provide testing. And she came back eligible to receive speech and language services, but the father denied. He said, I do not want my daughter to have these services. So just know that the parents can be either a supporting factor, or sometimes parents, this individual parent I had a good relationship with, and speaking with him, was very scared and worried about the stigma of their children being in special education. And because growing up as a child in the 80s, there was a heavy stigma of being in special education, and there still is. So if we lived in the perfect world and we were in utopia, This would be a student's IEP team. The parents would be there. If this was in high school, any transitional representatives, or if the child is moving from elementary to middle or middle to high, there would be some transitional representatives there. We were supposed to have one at my son's IEP going to 6th grade, but she wasn't able to make the meeting. There should be someone that represents the school system. There should be a regular education teacher, the student. I don't like that this says as appropriate. I think the student should be able to be there to be a part of the conversation. Special education teacher or provider, and then somebody who can interpret the results of any testing for parents and teachers, and others with knowledgeable expertise about the child. That could be the paraprofessional, that could be us. Now, as music educators, we probably have 50 to 100 students who could be eligible for IEPs or have an IEP. So it's not feasible for us to set in on every single meeting. But if you have a music teacher and an art teacher and a computer teacher and a librarian and a physical education teacher, there's 5 of you as a team who could take turns being a part of the individual education plans, the IEP meetings, and this person could go as a representative for this student and for the arts team, and this person can go as representative for the student and the arts team. That way the class educational needs that you have in art and library and computer and physical education and in music can be brought to the attention of the IEP team as a whole. Typically, as a parent, the IEP meetings that I've gone to is the principal has been in or out. The classroom teacher is there, the special education teacher is there, and maybe the school psychologist, just depending on the schedule. I've had meetings where the classroom teacher has been there and then had to leave halfway through. I've never had an art teacher or music teacher or physical education teacher be a part, not even write things in. I often would write notes and send it to the special education teacher to say, hey, here's what I'm observing, here's what I'm noticing might be a need, here are all of the successes I'm seeing. That's one thing I would offer for us as music educators is sometimes the IEPs, they don't start with the strengths. So if you do want to contribute something to your students' IEP meeting, start with what they're strong with, start with what they're doing well. Load them up with praise, because often these IEPs come from the point of view of what students can't do rather than what students can do. So some definitions that might help you. Again, an IEP is an individualized education plan. Not every student is going to qualify for an IEP. So the document of an IEP is written based on eligibility, those testing. So students can be tested. My son in Michigan was tested for autism, even though he had a clinical diagnosis of autism, even though that doctor said, in my 22 years, I've never seen anyone like Ben. His autism in the state of Michigan was not pervasive enough, and as such, he was denied services for autism, but he was found eligible for OHI. Now, they said, well, it's okay if he didn't qualify for autism because he'll still receive the same supports that he needs. As a teacher, they truly believed that they were going to provide for him the supports they needed. As a parent, they didn't provide for him the supports that they needed. They provided for his ADHD. They did not provide for his autism. So just be aware that if you're in an IEP meeting and the special education teacher says, oh, well, they're not eligible for this, but they did get eligibility for this, and it doesn't really matter what they're eligible for, they'll still receive the same services. That's often said to parents to kind of help them feel better, but it isn't always the truth. So, for example, I had students who had auditory processing differences, but the only time an auditory processing is an actual impairment. It is a type of hearing impairment. It only manifested in the music classroom, but if you think about our music classrooms, often they're tile. We have lots of instruments. We have lots of singing or percussion, and there's an overload of sensory input, not only from the talking and the moving and the shuffling of chairs and the shuffling of stands and the playing of the instruments and this and this and this and this. The student didn't receive the services they needed, but in my classroom, they couldn't function without noise-canceling headphones. Well, I wasn't allowed to take any of the noise-canceling headphones from the special education teacher because this child didn't qualify. So what did I do? I went to Target and I bought all of the earmuffs that I could find, and I put them in a basket, and I just made it a general announcement to the class. If anybody felt that the room was too loud while we were singing, while we were dancing, and while we were playing, I had a basket of earmuffs on the counter, and they were free for anyone. Now, granted, you need to take them home every week and throw them in the dryer because lice, but that's kind of how I had to work around that receiving services with the IEP, because that child wasn't found eligible. There should be many education stakeholders in the process, but typically the student is absent. My philosophy is that an IEP should be for and with the student, not just for. And often they're written by the adults for the student rather than with the student, is what I was trying to say. These goals can be academic. They can be functional goals. They can be transition. How do we transition them from elementary to middle to high? They can be social. And some states' social goals fall under functional goals. So functional goals could be organization. It could be getting to classes on time, like being able to get from, 6th grade A to 6th grade B. I'm sorry, I'm in middle school because my son is going into middle school. Transitional goals are typically either transitioning from self-contained to inclusion settings, and art and music are typically the first places that happens, or it's transitioning into new spaces. The IEP must be reviewed every year, and it has to be renewed every 3 years. So my son, we go through his IEP every May, and he just went through testing. And in 3 years, so 8th grade, at the end of 8th grade, he would go through it again. Now yesterday, my son requested that he not have an IEP. So I have to reach out to his case manager at the middle school and talk about what can we meet before school starts to see what things they want to put in place, to see how much we can pull back to help him gain some of that independence he really wants. But every year, IEP meetings will be reviewed to make sure to check for student progress and their goals, as well as then 3 years they're renewed. And so a student might have an IEP for 6 years or 9 years and then it not be renewed because they no longer are eligible for services. A typical IEP document will list it should list strengths first, but typically it starts with what they can't do. In Illinois, it starts with strengths. In Virginia, it starts with strengths. So it lists the disability, the services needed, length of time where services will be received, who's providing those services, any accommodations for learning and testing, as well as markers to track learning goals. A 504 is not an IEP, so a student who doesn't qualify for an IEP might have a 504, which is a list of accommodations to support learning, which could be, it's typically written by the parent and the classroom teacher, so it could well be in August that I go in with Ben, and Ben's like, I don't want an IEP, and it could be that we take those IEP suggestions and we turn it more into a 504. As much as I know that my son needs these supports, it could be a detriment to him because he's saying, no, I want to try it by myself. And it's scary, but I kind of have to give him that space because he's advocating for it. So it's really hard as a parent and as a teacher to have this knowledge, and it's going to be hard for you as a music educator when you see a student who can be independent in so many ways but needs supports in so many other ways. Sometimes it's just takes years for that independence to evolve, and sometimes that independence may never evolve. It really is just dependent on the student. Learning goals are not written in a 504 as they would be for an IEP. And I'm going to show you some learning goals here in a moment. The case manager is typically the special education teacher. In larger schools, there is just a case manager, and all they do is handle all of the special education cases and meetings with the special education teacher. Special education teachers typically are the ones who help classroom teachers implement the IEP, and often they co-teach. What's interesting is I've never had a special education teacher co-teach with me, and I think that collaborative relationship would be so amazing. So my last few years in school, I made teaching in the public school, I purposely went out and sought out I'm expecting a phone call in a minute, so I'm just muting that. So, case manager oversees the IEP meeting along with typically the principal and the school psychologist, but not always. And the special education teacher may not always be the case manager, but in smaller rural schools, usually the special education teacher carries all of the hats because they have to. Helpful people you might want to know. I was telling a story before I had to silence my phone. The last 3 years that I taught in the public schools, I made an effort to go sit and have lunch with a special education teacher or talk with them before school or after school. I would talk with the paraprofessionals during lunch. I would talk with the paraprofessionals in the morning as they were, getting ready and waiting for the students to get off the bus. Because I found in those conversations, I learned so much more about not only the students, but things that I could improve in my instruction that really benefited the students. And unfortunately, unlike a classroom teacher, we're not provided that planning time, typically, with the special education teacher or the classroom teacher, right? And so having to take the time of our own schedule, whether it be lunch or planning before or after school, to kind of build those relationships, while it did take away my time, quote unquote, my time, I found that it really benefited my instruction and the learning outcomes of those that I taught. So some people you might see in your school, an OT is an occupational therapist. They help with tying shoes, with eating, with walking, heel toe. Sometimes students walk on their tippy toes, being able to dress and undress, working on the physical, gross, and fine motor skills. Physical therapists as well work on more so the physical idea of lifting, working on coordination with writing. A paraprofessional is that individual who's either one-on-one or with a small group of children who are providing additional supports. In the paraprofessional video, we either have or we will talk more about how they should be supported and engaged with, because often the paraprofessional becomes the main teacher for the student with the IEP, and that's not how it should be. The speech and language pathologist is an individual who is working on developing speech and developing language in those with language delays. And then, of course, the school psychologist is usually the one who assists with and runs the testing for IEPs. So every spring I teach teaching music to students with disabilities and exceptionalities, and although I hate that because every student in my mind is exceptional, how do we define exceptional? I define it differently, I think, than what the gifted and talented people would define it as. But this student, she is not a music education student. She's actually a special education student, but she also plays oboe in our wind symphony, and she has experience writing IEPs. So I asked her to talk to the students this semester, and these are the slides that Kara developed. So I just want to give Kara credit because she did a really awesome job with, one, developing the slides, and two, teaching the students. So certain terms that you might see, typically you're going to see present level of performance rather than present level of academic achievement and functional performance. That's a little wordy, and that's a little that acronym is a little long. So PLP, if you hear a teacher talking about students as PLP, it's their present level of performance. You will have, again, goals that can be short-term or long-term. I've known my son's IEP, we've had long-term goals that are September to May, and we've had short-term goals that have been September to December or January to May. And again, these goals can be functional, and remember, sometimes social goals are grouped with functional goals, academic or transitional. Smaller goals help students work towards the long-term goals. Some students might just have a large group of smaller goals. Some students might have more long-term goals with smaller steps in between. It really is individual, again, why it's called an IEP, to the student. So the present level of performance describes what the student is able to do at the time of the IEP, their evaluation. It includes their strengths, but also areas for improvement, and sometimes includes, even though it should always include, input and concerns from parents. But understand that parents, may not be able to make the IEP meeting because the school isn't accommodating to their schedule. It could be that the parent doesn't want to be involved. Like, it's okay to have services, but you take care of it. I'm not going to. But in my as a parent, I have always been reached out to and asked to be part of and involved in my child's IEP. So when we write goals, we don't just pull them out of a hat. Students are observed over multiple days to see strengths and weaknesses to determine their present level of performance. Data is collected over the 30 days between the request of the meeting and the request of evaluation, and by the time evaluation is over. So you have that meeting of, I agree to have my son tested, blah, 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 blah. You have all of this data collected over a month, and the school psychologist and the other members of the IEP team, who, like the occupational therapist or what have you, those who are involved in collecting the data, they get together and they analyze their data to create the goals for the students. And so there are 4 components of a good goal. The condition, where is the goal, when and where is the goal going to be measured? So in music class, Johnny will pay attention with 3 or less reminders with 80% accuracy when initial directions are being given. Okay, so you have the condition, when and where. So it's going to be the music class, but when in music class? Is it during transitions? Or the support needed during transitions? Is the support needed during small ensembles? Is the support needed during instrument instruction, or during initial, like, transitioning from PE to music, or getting, having 5 minutes of music, and then that's their goal. They get through 5 minutes of music, and then we increase it over time. We describe the behavior, and that's what the student is supposed to be able to do. This is what we want them to do. Maintain participation in music for 10 minutes. And the criteria is, what do we consider success? So I had a student who was building up stamina to be in music over time, and if the student could come in and find their seat and maintain participation, which could just be looking at me, or maybe doing a few call and response, or doing the first movement activity, that was considered a success. If the student came in and sat and just watched, and there wasn't an emotional or physical response in being in the space, we considered that a success. So from September to May, that student was able to gradually get up to 30 minutes of musicking in class. So I'm going to let you pause and read this, and you can take a screenshot of it if you'd like, which is just a great guide in helping writing goals. You as a music educator will not ever write a goal, but if you know how to do this, when you read the IEP, you can take that math goal, that language arts goal, that social goal, and rewrite it in a way that makes sense to your classroom, and then be able to have a way to have data on that student. So finally, here are some examples of goals. When given a grade level text, Kara will read aloud with 80% accuracy on 3 consecutive trials. When given written instructions and manipulatives, Kara will complete a math activity with 85% accuracy on 4 consecutive trials. So if I say, when given notation, Kara will complete one piece that we're working on in band, so one piece with 85% accuracy on 4 trials. So if I'm working on page 8 of a certain band score that we're working on it for, say, 10 minutes, Kara gives me 85% by being able to maintain and practice for 8 of those 10 minutes. Or let's say Kara needs help with direction and remaining on task. During music class, Kara will respond to a prompt using a picture exchange communication, so that's the PEC board, on 3 occasions in a week. We will talk more about this when we have our synchronous session, but also here are your IEP and IEP processes. So in these links, all you need to do is just type it into your web browser, and that will not only give you the IEP documentation, but it'll also help you with the IEP process that is specific to your state. As always, if you have questions, just email Jessie and I, and we look forward to continue working with you. Thanks.
Goodbye. Goodbye.